China's property slump persists, with last month's figures showing declines in prices, investments and sales. Now, this comes 2 weeks after blueprints to defuse and prevent risks in the property sector were laid out at the country's biggest yearly political event, the Two Sessions. Now, they're all part of broader plans to help China hit its economic target growth at around 5%. Well, let's go straight to Lauren Ong. She joins us live from Beijing with so much more on this. Lauren, it's so interesting because it's not just the policymakers that are re-examining home ownership, but just ordinary Chinese are really having to struggle to navigate this market.
Well, Jill, over the past decade, we've seen property in China go from economic growth engine to a risk factor. It's a risk that authorities have identified and are actively looking to diffuse and prevent as part of broader plans laid out in the Two Sessions, as you've mentioned earlier. And this is really in stark contrast to the heydays of the pandemic boom, to the property boom where we see before the pandemic, where down to the attendees of the largest annual political event, they are up and center, front and center. You see real estate developers in attendance, showing that the property sector is really a key driver of China's economy. And that's in stark contrast to the recent years where they are noticeably lesser. This is also signaling that in recent years, the recalibration of the property sector and what it means for China has really trickled into society as well, especially as we see Chinese citizens reassess what owning a home means to them, especially as the concept of home ownership is deeply entrenched in wealth creation as well as Chinese culture. Let's have a deeper dive. Have a listen.
买房的，像原来想炒房那个，现在都不买了。
The last 3 years marked a rude awakening for this 55-year-old driver as he watches the value of his 2 flats erode with each passing year. Bought during China's housing boom before the pandemic, he recalls a time not long ago when he could make a fortune if he were to sell them.
我那时候买，现在不赔钱，现在还挣钱，但是没挣多少。但是19年卖的时候就能挣1半。 就是4000买能卖到8000，但现在就不行。
The Harbin resident has lived in the northeastern Chinese city for over 30 years, and the past 7 in his own apartment. At the same time, his son moved into the other flat after graduating. In China, housing is not just deeply tied to intergenerational wealth. In most cases, it's also a precondition for marriage, prompting parents to pour their life savings into preparing so-called marriage homes for their children.
有的人是咋呢？他没有太多的经济基础，尤其刚改的，就是刚结婚需要买房的，他自己没有那么雄厚的资金，也没有那么好的经济条件，他可能会需要父母帮衬。 父母帮衬的情况下，他就会考虑，他就会犹豫，我每个月月供我要还多少钱，我自己的薪资水平能不能覆盖我这个月供。
Property purchase has long been viewed as an investment that can't go wrong in China, but a housing crisis that emerged in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic has upended China's cultural mindset around home ownership, especially among its young people.
During the housing boom that began 2 decades ago, more than half of wealth creation came from the appreciation of housing prices. But home prices peaked in 2021 and have since dipped to mid-2019 levels, leaving those who bought at the peak stuck with properties worth much less. With property making up 70% of household wealth on average, it's a significant blow to people's spending power and the long-held belief in property as a guaranteed investment, especially among the next generation of homebuyers.
This symbolic effect tied ownership to marriage prospects, education access, and intergeneration wealth. I think for younger generations, they burdened by the high housing prices, and they also are facing stagnant wages. They are increasingly to question this narrative. So particularly when the housing prices in most cities kept dropping after the pandemic, houses seems no longer a good instrument for them to secure family wealth, especially for the younger generation.
having witnessed the generations before them driving home prices to levels beyond their reach before suffering steep losses in the current downturn. Many young Chinese are no longer as bent on as their parents when it comes to owning a home.
租房子住，我觉得现在也是一个特别好的一个选择，没有必要执着于非要去买一套房子，当做可能，我觉得可能有些人觉得是一套房子就相当于是一份执着，我觉得放下执着，你多体验其他的事情，我觉得可能会更好一些。
现在普通人来说，其实就是买房子并不是为了投资，而是为了就在这个城市有一个归属感，有个家就很温暖，就是这样，更多是来享受一个更好的环境。
The changing perspective is bad news for authorities who have, in their efforts to prop up the ailing property sector, pledged to increase the supply of government-subsidized homes to meet the needs of young people, among other measures. It doesn't help that the housing slump also coincides with seismic economic and demographic shifts.
Housing demand, as we said, fundamentally depends on income growth rate and population growth rate. Now, both indicators, these growth rates are going to be much lower than the previous 4 decades. So there is no reason to believe it's going to be really high housing price increase in the near future. So now, investors and home buyers, they're going to rethink, oh, should I buy this housing or not? What will happen to the housing price in the future?
Although property sales have improved in some regions, such as first-tier cities Beijing and Shanghai, most lower-tier cities continue to struggle, forcing developers and local governments, which rely heavily on land sales as a source of revenue, to get creative.
Well, all these changing perspectives really come as China continues to grapple with a property slump for its 5th year. And still, just yesterday, official figures released showed that there is a decline in property prices, sales, as well as in investments. That's despite the slew of measures that were released last year, including mortgage cuts, as well as lower lending rates, Jill.
So, Lauren, we heard you speaking to some young people in your story, and they're saying, look, there really isn't a need to buy the property. So are the measures that you just mentioned enough to move the needle, particularly in this demographic?
Well, it's interesting to look at the details of the government work report. And one of the most apt to note is the emphasis on what it calls quality housing, which is what it defines as housing that is safe, comfortable, eco-friendly, as well as smart. And they're also intensifying efforts to redevelop urban villages as well as to renovate old and dilapidated houses. But we do see some contrasting trends. For example, here in Beijing, it's a first-tier city. We see young people snapping up exactly those old and dilapidated housing. In 2024, we saw that daily transaction volumes actually almost doubled on year, according to local media reports. And even in a fourth-tier city like Fuxing, one of the cities that I visited as part of this series, I saw we see that young people are actually flocking to these smaller cities to snap up cheaper and smaller homes. And it's actually gaining traction in social media. It's gone viral in social media. So this is of interest as authorities are actively courting young home buyers, as we see the measures they have put out to cater to this demographic. And indeed, the older generation are the ones who have already bought their homes during the housing boom, and they aren't exactly in the market for new homes. And analysts I spoke to actually think that this is something worth looking into. Let's have a listen.
If he really sees no opportunity of good job in large city, it's rational for them to move to a place with lowest housing cost and living cost as low as possible. But is this going to be, it's going to happen at a large scale? This, I'm sure, is something the Chinese government is going to monitor very closely. Because after all, I think this, to a large extent, it is a waste of talent. It's a waste of talent because, let's say, these young people, they just graduated from college. If they have better job opportunity, they could make good use of their education and human capital.
Yeah, Lauren, so many questions here. China, of course, is still going to look to move forward on the promises of more stimulus and more measures. But as you worked through this series, this three-part series, how would you quantify the impact the housing crisis has had on Chinese society, and how are they moving forward?
Well, I would say property purchase is still viewed as an indispensable growth engine from local media reports to analysts that I've spoken to. And indeed, the property sector has, for the past few years, accounted for about a quarter of China's GDP. And even down to locals I spoke to, they say that the prospect of buying a home is indispensable to their lifestyle, especially when we understand that the sector actually holds 70% of China's household wealth and also takes in about a quarter of bank loans. So while housing and the idea of owning a home still is largely indispensable, I do see that there are changes in some shape or form. Like when I spoke to the older generation who are very demoralized from the diminished returns that they're seeing, they see this as possibly an opportunity to provide the extra homes that they have bought during the property boom to give it to their children as a form of passing on intergenerational wealth when they hit certain milestones like marriage or when they get a new job in a new city. And for the younger people that I spoke to, they're more open to renting or even buying cheaper and smaller homes in rural areas and then traveling out via the high-speed railways to play or even earn money before they come back to the home base in these rural areas. So there is sort of a shift from viewing housing as an ironclad way to get high investment returns and to sort of more as a thing and that can complement the lifestyle that they chose, Jill.
Lauren, thanks so much for looking into this story for us. Lauren Ong, live from Beijing. Now, do tune in to East Asia Tonight on Wednesday as well as Thursday, because that's when we're having part 2 and 3 of our China housing crisis series.